going to look at superpower relationships, okay? The origins of the Cold War. This is what we're going to be looking at today. Oh, sorry. So hopefully we're going to look at, you understand what the term the Cold War means. The difference between the two countries is mainly about ideology and how the countries were run. One is capitalist, one's communist. And the idea of what the Grand Alliance was and why America and Russia were allied during the war and how that then broke down. This is the key to it, really. That's just key terms that I think hopefully you'll understand. When I say the Soviet Union and the USSR, they are the same people. Okay, the same country. We don't call, the Soviet Union does not exist anymore. The USSR does not exist because what the Soviet Union was Russia, which was the main country, but all the other countries around it, which are now separate. Okay, so when I use the word Soviet Union or USSR or sometimes even Russia, we are meaning the same thing. Okay. So situation in Europe in 1945, this is the end of the war, okay? So as you can see from the pictures on here, is that it was pretty much devastation, okay? Most of those pictures there are of Europe. The one down the bottom right-hand corner is not Europe, actually, but it was almost certainly going to be America. America was not badly affected, or as badly affected as Europe was. So most of the world was quite badly damaged at the end of the Second World War, which you probably would, you know, if you studied the Second World War, you would know. Now, one of the key things that you should be thinking about, okay, entire cities have been destroyed in Europe. And if you look at the table on the bottom of that screen, one thing you might notice about that, if you look at it closely, is how many people, how many civilians and soldiers the USSR or Soviet Union lost. Okay, we are talking about over 20 million people. Okay, and now you've got to keep that in your mind to a large extent, because that does explain some of what went on later on. The fact that they lost more people, civilians and soldiers, than all the other countries put together. Okay, so that changed the way they kind of thought for a large part of post-war time. Now, during the Second World War, it brought together a shift in politics. The old powers like Britain and France, who, don't forget, we had the largest empire before the Second World War, was finished. It was gone. Okay, Britain no longer become a superpower really after the Second World War, but during the war, one of the things that you've got to remember is that this Grand Alliance between the USA, Britain, and the Soviet Union joined together in what coming the Grand Alliance. Okay, and they came together to defeat Germany and Japan. Okay, and now Britain and America, as you probably are fully aware, got on anyway, have always done, and not always with the Soviet Union though. So that's kind of a bit of a strange alliance really between the USA and the Soviet Union and Britain. Didn't really, you know, it's an unusual one. It came out, and we'll look at why that was and what happened about it afterwards. So one thing that you've got to remember, trying to remember if you can, the Soviet Union led by Stalin wanted Britain and America to open up a second front in battlefield. Okay, Germany, even though they did an alliance with Germany, beginning of the war, Germany started to attack Russia or Soviet Union badly, and they suffered tremendously. And Stalin, who was the leader of Russia at the time, wanted America and Britain to start up a second front to take away the pressure that they were suffering. And it took a lot of argument. So D-Day was that second front. But as you know, as some of you may know, it didn't happen until 1944. Now, Stalin thought the Allies waited until right at the end, almost, of war, because he thought that they were deliberately stalling so that Soviet Union would be weakened. And whether that's true or not, we're never going to really know. Okay, so his thought during the war was America and Britain aren't really doing their bit. They could start up a second front in Europe, take the pressure off of the Soviet Union, divert some of Germany's attention away. And that didn't happen until 1944. So the war had been going on for quite a few years. before America and Britain joined together in Europe to try to attack Germany. The USSR, as I said, suffered enormously when Germany invaded in 1941. Millions of civilians were killed in a brutal war as well. Now, with the invasion of the USSR, the Soviets became allies with Britain and America, as I mentioned. Initially, they were not part of the war, really. They signed a pact with Hitler. And so when the war started for Britain, the Soviet Union weren't involved. And then America joined in later on when they attacked Pearl Harbor, and then Germany attacked the Soviet Union. So that brought them in. So really, the reason why they all came together is because they were all trying to fight Germany. That's why the Grand Alliance happened. They all tried to fight. They were actually uniting against fascism and the Nazis. Okay. And the leaders of the Allied forces met to discuss the war. And they had conferences, 3 main conferences, which you will come across in your exams. And they always come up. The ones that they do come up most of all are Yalta and then Potsdam. They came at the end of towards the end of the war, 1945. Okay, Tehran, sometimes they mention in exams, but they always, nearly always, they're going to wait to conferences, is when the leaders get together. They always, nearly always talk about Yalta and Potsdam. But that's another lesson, really, those conferences. So, when the war ended, the Soviet Red Army had control of Eastern Europe and including Eastern Germany as well. Okay, Britain and American armies had control of Western Europe. And in May 1945, Britain, America, and USSR technically were still allies, but the relationship was starting to become a bit tense. And Britain and America was suspicious of the Soviets. They didn't trust the Soviets, and the Soviets didn't trust Britain as well. It's a two-way thing. The Soviets did not fully trust Britain and America, as I was just saying. Now, this is a map of the Europe at the end of the war. As you can see, all the ones in red are the countries that the Soviet Union kind of were in control of. Okay. And the countries in blue are the ones which you would say not under control of Britain and America, but these were Western democracies. They had elections, and they were Britain and France. Britain and America had a say in some of these countries, and America helped these countries an awful lot. Spain was a bit strange, actually. One of the reasons why it's white. Spain was not part of the Western democracy. It was a fascist dictatorship under a man called Franco. And it stayed like that until 1975, a bit out of the way, really. So it doesn't really get involved. And one thing you might notice is this kind of a white line between the two, and we'll come on to that a bit later on. That came to be known as kind of the Iron Curtain. It wasn't a real curtain. It didn't really exist. It was imaginary, just a figure of speech, really. But that's kind of another lesson, really. So, now, one thing that you've got to remember is one of the reasons why they didn't trust each other is because they had different ways of working, okay? Britain and America were capitalist, the Soviet Union was communist, okay? During the Russian Civil War, when Russia had a civil war back in the 1917 onwards, the British and Americans fought and assisted the non-communist White Army, which upset people like Stalin. The USSR believed Americans and British wanted communism to fail. So the Soviets were thinking, America and Britain want our country to fail. And also, one thing that you've got to bear in mind is that, especially America, they didn't like the idea of communism. We'll come to what communism is in a moment. And the British didn't support the USSR against the threat from Nazi Germany. If you've done any lessons about the build-up to war in your school, one thing that you might have remembered is that when Germany was moving east, Britain did very little about it. When it was going towards the Soviet Union, did very little about it. Stalin thought, well, you're doing it deliberately. You're letting Germany get stronger and stronger, but they're coming my way. And of course, that built up a little bit of tension as well. And Stalin didn't forget all this. Now, Cold War, what does it really mean? The term Cold War, a state of political hostility between countries, threats, propaganda. And so there's no actual real fighting between America and the Soviet Union, okay? there was hostility, there were threats and propaganda against each other. No real fighting between the Soviet army and the American army. Okay, they might have fought and helped other countries do that, but they didn't fight themselves. Now, one thing I want to come on to a little bit here is the idea between capitalism and communism. Okay, the difference, it's going to be a very brief one. This could be a whole lesson in itself, really. So communism. So the idea that communism is that the people are at the centre of everything, and the government or the state plans everything and runs everything. Okay, so they dictate what country, so any factories or shops are owned and controlled by the state. Under capitalism, which we live under now, it's the other way around. Okay, the government help people, but really most companies and businesses and factories and shops are privately owned, and we work for a boss. We don't all work for the government. Some people do work for the government under capitalism, like teachers, police officers, doctors, indirectly paid by the government, but most businesses are privately owned. Okay, so all factors of production are owned by private individuals. Under communism, it's the state or the government that run it. Leadership in capitalist society, you vote for a leader, and we have more than one party. In communism, usually there's no real need. It's run by a committee. Don't always have a leader, and it's only usually one political party. If you look at China, for example, today, there's only one political party. Factories, as I said, are owned by individuals, or companies might own them. And the communism, it's not run for profit. The driving force behind capitalism is profit. The driving force behind communism is not profit. It's meant to be about the sharing and the benefit of everybody. Okay, meant to be, doesn't always work that way, especially under Soviet Union and China. Farming as well, the collectivization in capitalism, farms are privately owned, so they can go bust. They buy their own equipment. Under communism, the equipment that is bought for them usually. They have mass farms, and they might make and produce food, which should be needed and directed by the government. Okay, now under communism, we look anything about the history of Russia, that didn't work very well at all, and a lot of people starved. If you think about this, how the country is organised, very much like a pyramid. The people at the top, okay, small number of people at the top, and a few people in the middle, and like some bosses maybe, middle classes, and then the vast majority of people are at the bottom. Okay, so this represents like the numbers of people. Okay, and communism, you get a few people running the show, but everyone's meant to be equal. Meant to be. Doesn't always work that way, as you know if you look at the history of the countries. Now, one thing that you want to remember is the people who took part in all this. As you can probably recognise Churchill there on the right, Roosevelt in the middle, and then you've got Stalin on the left, okay, leader of the Soviet Union. So that was mostly during the war. These people were the leaders of the countries of Britain as well during the war, okay. They masterminded, obviously they all got together to defeat Germany and Japan. Formerly Germany invaded USSR, okay. USA and Britain remained suspicious of Stalin, just to kind of recap, and then they met towards the end of the war together. Now, some of the people changed. So one of the first conferences, as you can see, those three people at the top, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill. Towards the end of 1945, the personnel were changed. On the left, on the bottom picture, you've got Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, and he had won a general election. Unbelievably, Churchill lost a general election in 1945 in Britain, and Britain elected a Labour government, so we had a different leader. And in the middle was a man called Harry Truman, who was extremely anti-communist, didn't trust communism at all. And of course, Stalin's still there, and his relationship with Truman really deteriorated badly. Okay, now one thing about these conferences is that they were discussing what to do with Germany and what to do with the rest of the world once the war had finished. And one of the things that kind of Truman kept secret was that they were developing a bomb, a nuclear bomb. Okay, he had an ace card that gave him confidence to make demands of other leaders. America had developed the atomic bomb, the most powerful and destructive bomb ever made at the time, still is. And at this time, a point in time, the atomic bomb was solely in the hands of the United government. Okay, so when they were discussing what to do with Europe, they were kind of equal. And then they were discussing, and the Soviet Union was going to help America defeat Japan. Now, unbeknown to Soviet Union, America was developing this bomb, which they then used. It's worth remembering that the atomic weapons have only been used twice. Okay, well, both of the times on Japan at the end of the Second World War and by America. And that changed everything, because once they used that bomb, they didn't need the Soviet Union's help. And the Soviet Union and Stalin felt even more suspicious about America, because the dropping of the atomic bomb really, even though America at the time said, hang on a minute, we need to have this because the Japan won't surrender otherwise. What a lot of people, and I think Stalin was right in thinking this to a large extent, was a lot of people thinking, well, America have only used this to threaten, to really show the Soviet Union, this is what we've got. We have got this weapon and we're prepared to use it. And we don't need the Soviet Union. So America came out of the war in a far, far stronger position, than they went in. Okay, they not only were they more dominant in Europe, more dominant around the world, they were more powerful, and of course they had this nuclear weapon. And the same for the Soviet Union to a large extent. If we go back to that map, and I'm going to finish on this in a minute, we go back to that map again. Soviet Union, as you can see was there, not only was it quite a large country, as it controlled a lot of other countries, but all those other countries that the Soviet Union, when they were marching towards Germany, they took over Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. They were all communist as well. They made them communist. And because Britain, France, America, and Russia, Soviet Union all got into Germany at the same time, they divided Germany as well. So Soviet Union also came out of this war very much more powerful than they went in. So therefore, at the end of the war, you had two massive powers, America, who controlled lots of the world as well, and they had a nuclear weapon, and the Soviet Union, who controlled lots of Eastern Europe. Okay, so that kind of set it up as, well, we don't need to be friends anymore because we've defeated Germany, we've defeated Japan, and now they're kind of standing alone. Right, who's going to control what? So now,